so if you're really truly honest about like things like an open door policy or being vulnerable, you need to go to the people. And so setting that stage so that people feel like you actually do care. And so
Mhm.
I think as leaders, we need to really kind of reflect on how we show up.
Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple. This podcast is created for clinical leaders, nurse educators, and executives that want to learn how to create a safe space in situations that are clinically chaotic and in a disrupted healthcare system here in British Columbia and in Canada. Today, we have an incredible interview with an emergency room nurse, nurse educator, and clinical education consultant, Ellison Chung. Ellison and I have a conversation about a wide range of things, but we focus in on what it takes today in today's healthcare environment to create a safe space, both for those that are learning how to be nurses, as well as for managers, clinical leaders, and even executives. I know you're going to enjoy today's episode. So without further ado, let's get right into the show. So, Ellison, I'm so glad that you're here to share on Safe Space Made Simple. Thanks for being here. I think the first thing or place I'd like to start is just to hear, what is it that got you into the work that you're doing now? What's the work you're doing right now? And what do you love about it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I've been working in emergency departments across the lower mainland for, gosh, over like a decade now. And it's been like a really fun ride. I grew up as like a baby nurse, student nurse, new grad, got trauma trained, triage trained, like the whole works. And it's been quite the journey. And I started to notice, like, as I progressed through my career, especially after COVID, that there was a lot of inequities in
Mm.
healthcare and especially in emergency departments, and to no fault of their own. Like, departments are trying their best. Like, they're responding to the needs. Like, our doors are always open 24/7. We take whoever walks in that door. And over time, I just noticed that it just became not so much a problem, but like patients became more sick and staff became more burnt out.
Hmm.
And they're wanting to help and they're wanting to pick up overtime. They're wanting to really serve the people of BC. And so yeah, like over time, I just noticed that I wonder if there's a different way that we could kind of approach this. And my dream growing up has always been a teacher. And I was like, why don't I start going into education? Because I think, at the front lines, it's really hard to teach. And I see that, time is strapped, but I enjoy it so much. And so, anyways, I ended up leaving while still doing casual in Emerge, but I ended up taking a gig starting to teach nursing students. And I was like, this is where our opportunity lies. It's all in education because these are the minds that they're so open, they're so willing and so receptive to hear the experiences of people on the front lines. And they want to know how they can create positive change. And they
Mm.
want to know when they come into the department, they come into these units, that they actually make a difference. And so I ended up taking that path, and lo and behold, it's coming up to a decade doing that path. And in my new role now, we're looking at it from a systems level. How can we create change in educate with education to help create systems change? And I think it's like absolutely fantastic. And this is a new role that's been kind of crafted out of a need, and I have been loving it since day
Mm.
one, honestly.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work because I have to say that I have to give a bit of a shout out to educators that I work with in the system. I love working with nurse educators. They're just
Yeah.
such advocates for change in the system. And there's sort of that bridge between all the clinical leaders and the manager and the point of
Yeah.
care or the front line. And so I'm so glad to hear you say what you're or share what you're sharing. And I also want to ask you a couple of questions here because you're talking on different layers. There's like the individual things that
Yeah.
you noticed, the inequities that you mentioned, and then there's systemic. So let's start with the inequities. As you've moved into education and you're working with those really open new students, what sorts of things are you teaching them so that when they hit the ground running, they've got some skills and tools to be able to navigate what's going on in our healthcare system?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's really funny. We had this very similar conversation this week, and we keep hearing on the front lines, oh, we got to teach our students to be resilient. We got to make sure that they don't burn out. So we got to give them strategies so that they can hold their own. And I think almost need to kind of reframe that, because that puts so much onus and you have the weight of the world on you.
Right.
And you finish school and you come into the system and you're like, wow, this system is massive. And now I have to hold this up. I have to be that tough person. I have to be doing self care, and I got to make sure that I can show up the next day. And I'm like, that's fine and all, but what about the system? What has the system done for you? And what are you noticing in the system to help support you in this? And, I've talked to nurses like, in my own friend group and when I teach, and they're just so sick and tired of resiliency. They don't want to be told to be resilient. And
I think
I
if we
have
tell
to agree.
nurses, I think if we tell nurses one more time that they need to be resilient or take care of themselves, we're going to get a revolt. I agree with you,
100%.
man. Like, and we've got to I love the word reframe that you brought up. So you look at how do we reframe this? So on a micro, what are some of the reframes that you're helping students to make around this conversation? Because I think that resiliency is a byproduct of some things
Mhm.
that we do internally and externally. And so I'm curious, what sorts of things are you teaching your students to be able to do to reframe?
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the big things that when we go into the classroom or go into workshops, is really kind of questioning um, how you're feeling, or looking at with awareness of how you're feeling today. Are you feeling 100%? Are you feeling a little bit stormy? Are you feeling like, the rain clouds are kind of coming in? Like, how are we showing up today? And, taking a moment to kind of doing that self check. And if you're feeling stormy, I'm okay with that. I think that's showing up truly authentically you, and practicing that gratitude to say, I showed up today. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
feeling 100%, but I really want to do this. And I know I can't put up my 100%. And a lot of times I've noticed in my career and my practice is that we tell people, well, you come here, you got to make sure you're at your best. You've got to make sure you do this X, Y, and Z. And if you don't feel that way, there's this negativity attached, and you feel guilt that you don't show up. And so I think it's just that openness to accept, and then creating that culture with your peers and the educators around you, that it's okay. If you're
Mm-hmm.
not showing up 100%, to be okay to verbalize that. And it might show up very differently. I might turn my camera off today because what you have to teach me, I want to learn. I just can't show up physically. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to listen. And on the unit, not 100% today. Is it okay that I take an easier assignment? I'm not
Right.
asking you to go easy on me, but I just need to take a little bit more of a cognitive load off of me.
Mm-hmm.
And that honesty is so important, because as soon as I hear that, I'm like, that's a no-brainer. I feel
Mm-hmm.
those days too. And then we connect authentically that way. And
Right.
that once that connection happens, that's when the learning happens. Because,
Yeah.
down the line, you're going to open up to me and I'm going to open up to you, and we really grow together.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really big unlock that you're talking about. And right away I think about what is it that would prevent somebody from, you know, being honest about how they're feeling. And our culture in the healthcare system is often sort of just, you know what, muscle up, keep going, don't talk about anything, just, and I think that that's changing. To your point, I think that, people like you and others, leaders, educators, patient care coordinators, managers are all having these conversations and saying, yeah, we need to create a psychologically safe space where people can be honest about what's really going on. And that's what gives us access to more energy, more resilience, all of those things, relational connection, and all of those things. And to your point, what would it be like for us to be that real with one another and receive the support that we need to be our best at work? I was just also thinking about another thing. We have imposter syndrome. I think that you mentioned imposter
Oh
syndrome.
yeah.
We all have that. That's a ubiquitous thing that we all kind of question about ourselves. I just heard something else from Dr. Michael Gervais, who's a performance thought leader, and he talks about FOPO in his latest work.
Oh.
And FOPO is the idea of fear of people's opinions, and and
Ah.
and how if we actually take a risk to be real with one another, something really really dramatic can happen. So when you are talking to students, what are some of the barriers that they have internally that stop them from being that honest? Because we'll talk about the systemic barriers in a minute, but what are some of the internal or immediate barriers that come to mind for you that you help your students overcome?
Yeah, and like this question has come up over and over again because, like, as we go into the research and we kind of look at how students feel in the classroom or how nurses might feel when they're learning something brand new, we're really brought up to be on our guards. We want to make sure we present the best of ourselves to the person in front of you, even a conversation like this, and to set that really authentic space is the one way for me to think about it is kind of thinking of the term trauma informed, that
Right.
trauma informed approach. And really, the underpinnings of that is that kind of recognizing the people that show up come up with their own lived experiences, whether that be a patient, whether that be a nurse, whether that be the charge nurse, the educator, the manager, whoever you interact with. They all bring that into that conversation when you're with them together. Um, and in recognizing that, we have to give people the opportunity to reflect, have choice, and then also being compassionate.
Mm.
And we have to be compassionate with, like, role model what compassion looks like. And if I'm going to tell you, be kind to yourself, like it's going to be okay, I got to make sure I show up and do that as well and be
Mhm.
authentic and say, I have had those exact same feelings. Not this, probably very similar to what you're feeling right now, where I feel like I need to make sure I'm correct all the time.
Right.
But we recognize over time that when we show up and we make mistakes, and admit to those things, we recognize that nobody really cares,
Right.
that in anything, when you admit to these mistakes and you own up to them, and you figure out a strategy to move forward, people respect you even more.
Right.
And so I think it's just like showing up and helping our students, teach them these skills, but also role modeling and showing them that that's okay.
So this is awesome, Ellison. I think that what you're sharing about being a space holder, there's modeling and embodying what it is that you're hoping for from your students is as a huge solution or key there. What are the areas where you've had to get honest in that space and to model that? What you mentioned one of them with sort of that's I think most educators are like that too. They feel like they have to be really perfect all the time. What are some challenges that you've shared with your students that have helped to unlock that space for them too?
That's a great question. And I don't even have to dig very deep because it really just happened. So I recently just finished grad school, and one of my final projects, I, in my mind, completely bombed. Like I just didn't get the objectives. And it was a group project. We got so much feedback from all these partners, from faculty to patient partners to community members, and they had so much feedback. So I was like, we completely missed the ball on this. Like we just didn't know how to do it. We didn't know how to come together. And I brought this up in the classroom, and everyone was like, why are you sharing this? Like, it's just undermining who you are as an educator. And I was like, but this is who I am. And I want to show you that I am full of faults as well. And I make mistakes. And what was good that came from that, though, and we were so defeated. I couldn't even express how defeated we were. But
Mhm.
we got the most amount of feedback compared to any other group project. We got so much engagement from every partner that we reframed it for ourselves to say they wouldn't have cared enough to give us this much. They wouldn't have given us this much feedback if they didn't care so passionately about our project.
Right.
That shows how engaged they were and how engaged they wanted this to show up as a final product. And once we kind of honed in on that, I was like, the doors just opened and we just thrived. And so
Mhm.
I kind of showed that example to our students to say, even if you do make a mistake, even if you do completely miss the ball, that is absolutely okay. It's not going to crush your world. And there is this analogy I'll end with where a really senior colleague once told me, what does failure mean? And failure isn't that traditional term of just not being successful. They mentioned to me failure stands for first attempt in learning.
Hmm.
And once I heard that, I was like, this is magical. I need to hold on to this.
That's a great acronym. I've never heard that before, Ellison. Thank you for that. First attempt
Attempt.
in learning. F A
That's
I
right.
L. Wow, that's
That's right.
I and thank you for sharing your graduate studies story, because I'm actually, that encourages me a little bit. I'm just in the middle of doing I just finished my research proposal for my grad studies, and I'll be launching a project in fall. And if I'm super honest, I am freaking out that it's going to fit bomb. I'm just not even sure how to move forward with it. So I'm asking for some help and getting some help for that. But that little story you shared there, that really encourages me. And it's also kind of crazy that we are so reluctant to quote fail end quote in the process of learning. I mean, how else do you learn than making mistakes, discovering what works, what doesn't, and then moving and iterating and doing it again? Like I kind of question myself in this because I'm constantly putting pressure on myself to be perfect. And that does not create a very good learning environment for me. And that's what I hear in what you're sharing too. It doesn't create a learning environment for anybody. Hey, everybody, this is Trace, just popping in briefly to just ask you a question while you're listening to the show. Is this podcast serving you? Over the last several weeks, I've had a lot of people come to me and say that they really enjoyed the show and that they've joined the subscription to hear it each week. And so my invitation to you is, if you're enjoying the show, would you mind giving us a rating and a review and subscribing so that we can make sure that you're getting the show and the things that we're offering every single week? When you review or share the podcast or subscribe to it, or you rate it with the star rating on the particular platform you're listening, what that does is it establishes to us that we are providing something that is meaningful and that is serving you, and that also then attracts more guests and people that will serve you going forward as well. The original intention of this show was actually, quite frankly, to do something that was going to engage me while I was doing my graduate studies, to interview some of the thought leaders that I was reading about and studying, and also then to amplify messages from healthcare that are positive and that really gives a platform for people that are doing incredible work like you've been listening to. If you go back through the episodes so far, you'll find everybody is really providing an incredible space in the work that they're doing. And so that's what this show is all about. So if that resonates with you, one of the things that you could do is either to obviously subscribe to the show, give it a rating on the platform that you're on, give it a review of some kind, and then of course share the show with others as well, because we're not marketing this. This is something that we trust and hope that will grow naturally and will become a force for changing healthcare. Thanks again so much for listening and for supporting what we're doing. And now back to the show.
Right.
So I wonder about, how do you create that kind of culture on the floor when it feels like the stakes are so high, especially when you're working in practice now? You've come through, you're not a student anymore. You're now developing your practice in the first couple of years. How do you create an environment where it feels safe to fail when there's a fear that the mistake might actually cause harm of some kind?
That's a great question. And when I'm the educator on the floor, and I've mentored quite a few nurses now, and it's very difficult, right? Like you said, the stakes are quite high. But at the end of the day, who is determining those stakes are high? Who is determining what is the standard we must meet in the department? And it comes down to that really deeply embedded culture. And so when I'm the educator on the floor, I try to kind of show up in a space where I give people time and be curious to their decision making. And I think that is maybe one solution. There's, I'm sure, tons of solutions out there. And I do want to give props to the educators that are working on the floor right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is when we show up and we give people a chance to really tell us how they came to that decision making, we can come as educators now to really start to kind of pick that apart and start to really dive a little bit deeper, ask more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes I've noticed when time is strapped, people are burnt out, and we got to get things going, especially in emerge. Like, we got that bed moving over there. That person's dying. We got to help this person. So it feels like everything has to be in a rush. And
Mm-hmm.
there are times, yes, there are times when that has to happen, but there's also way more times where that isn't happening. And if we're being honest with ourselves, do those moments in time have to be rough?
Mm-hmm.
And when I show up to the bedside and I talk to the nurse and like, tell me about your patient, tell me about your plan of care for the day. Tell me about your decision making here. What is
Mm-hmm.
your next 15-minute plan? What is your next 30 minutes? What does the next hour, few hours look like for you? Explore that a little bit, be curious.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something I've learned along the way. The more curious I show up, that space, that energy just kind of starts to dissipate. And that
Mm-hmm.
anxiety starts to dissipate because if Ellison's not worried and he's just asking me all these questions. And, this person who I presume is not doing well is actually fine. I guess I do have a minute or two to actually really think and reflect on what I need to do.
Right.
And I'll give you an example. I showed up to one of the emergency departments to check in with the student, and we had a good conversation, and things were kind of going on the background. She's like, "I think I have to go," and I was like, "Well, why don't we just take a moment and take stock of what's happening?" And we kind of went around and we looked around, and I was like, "We're not going to touch any patients. We're just going to take a look." And so we took a look at the unit, and I was like, I can tell you right now that bed 4 over there, that's probably the sickest person. And I assume this, and this is happening, but I mean, it's important. But I think we have a few minutes to actually talk about it. And I knew nothing about the patients. And she was like, "How did you know that was the sickest person?" And I was like, "I've done this for a bit. I've seen the patients, and really take your time." Because when we rush is when we make mistakes. If that's when we start rushing into a decision making that doesn't make sense, or it doesn't make sense to us. And so until it makes sense for you, start to ask more questions. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's a bit of role modeling. It's a bit of showing them how to do things. And oftentimes I find it works quite well.
Yeah, this is really interesting, because one of the things that I talk about in my work is moving at the speed of your presence and
Yeah.
slowing down so that you can go faster than you can if you try to go fast. So in other words, if you want to get a lot done and get it done really quickly, you need to slow down, not speed up. And so what gives people access to that is understanding what they're doing inside. And as I hear you tell this story, you strike me as somebody who generates a safe space with your presence. And so as you're walking into that, what are some of the things you're doing internally that creates that space? Because sometimes I've seen when people are being curious, it can be really activating for the person that they're asking questions, and they feel the energy of sort of assessment or the pressure to be perfect again. Whereas something that you're doing and others, many others like you, are also doing is creating this different kind of space where people can sense and feel, no, there is time and space here, and I can do this with this person. So what are you doing internally to create that and generate that kind of space, Ellison?
You know what? I just go into a different world. No, just kidding. uh, and you know what? It's a great question again. And, I think I've been doing a lot of work with mindfulness and listening to podcasts like yours and other podcasts, and really just taking that moment for myself before I walk
Mm,
into a conversation, before I do something I perceive to be, a little bit more important, or really just in my day to day. I take a few moments for myself, do some breathing. And my counselor really recommended me kind of start very, very early in the beginning stages
mhm,
of thinking about, just walking on the street. When you're walking on the street, and you're getting ready to do the crosswalk, you press the button and the light changes. I want you to wait 3 seconds. Count to yourself, deep breathe, whatever you need to do, and notice your surroundings, and then move. Because
mhm,
more oftentimes than not, as soon as it turns green, I mean, in a car it's a little bit different, but if you're walking, is there any rush to cross the street right now?
mhm,
And when we take that moment for ourselves, we start to our heart rate decreases, our breathing gets regulated, my hormones get regulated, and I show up just a little bit differently. And I
mhm.
think that when we do that, um, as humans, we connect in a very, very kind of relational way where I can feel your energy coming in. And if you're coming in hot and heavy, I feel that.
Mhm,
But if you're coming in kind of a little bit more soft and open, I also feel that.
mhm.
And so it's these very kind of, I think, nothing crazy, but very small things we can do. And it comes with practice, obviously. But you take that intentionality into it, that picture, and it really makes such a huge difference in the
It does.
person across from you.
Yeah, I think it does too. This is actually the foundation of all of my work. And it was because I had to learn how to do this out of desperation more than anything else, and the need to be able to survive, because most of my life, professionally and personally, was spent in really reactive, urgent cultures and systemic distress. And so it took a long time for me to realize that I could generate a safe space from inside of me with those same kinds of skills you're describing. And then when I did that, first of all, I'm on the top of my list. I'm taking care of myself in a way that's different than when I don't do that. And then what really surprised me was the way that that has a ripple effect for the people around me. And they actually get to experience me in a different way, and they get to experience themselves in a different way too. And everybody gets a choice if they step into that or not, but the chances are much better if that space is there and they're experiencing it, for them to step into it and generate it for themselves as well. The other thing I think about that you described so nicely, even with the hormonal things that are going on, is that there's a self-regulative and co-regulative effect that our nervous systems are having with each other all the time, that is relational. It starts when we're babies and we're learning how to self-regulate
Exactly.
in our moms. And that self-regulative skill comes from us experiencing that nervous system that we're literally living inside. And then when we're born, we think, wow, we don't need that anymore, but we do. We still
You
need that.
do.
right? Like, so I really appreciate the way you describe that. So as you look at this now, you mentioned earlier that you've moved into this other role where you're doing more systemically. And it makes me wonder, what can we do systemically? What can leaders and managers do to create the environment where these kinds of safe spaces are the norm and not the exception?
And this is great because like I think about my leader, and she is phenomenal. And I keep reflecting back, like what makes her phenomenal, and how can
Right.
I share this with the world and kind of create change from a systems level. And it really kind of comes down to something we tell people all the time. You know, you read all these leadership articles, you read these educational leadership articles and things like that. And they all say, you know, be open, have an open door policy, you know, that type of stuff. But like really that still makes that person want to come to you, or
Right.
it's still the onus is on the other person. And so if you're really truly honest about like things like an open door policy or being vulnerable, you need to go to the people. And so setting that stage so that people feel like you actually do care. And so
Mhm.
I think as leaders, we need to really kind of reflect on how we show up. And you know, is more than just setting up time to say, hey, come whenever I have these office hours
Mhm.
that are dedicated to you. Come to me if you need any help. Those that are very self-aware and they have a lot of insight and they know what they need for their own learning and their growth and development will come to you. But what about the people that don't, or they have
Right.
that fear still? You have to go to them. It's more work, it's not easy, but your gains are going to be way more tenfold. And then
Mhm.
from a systems level, like if you're thinking really big, thinking how maybe things like the province should show up, or even the nation can show up, we
Right.
need to make opportunities that leaders can have more professional development, that we actually care about what leaders have to say,
Right.
because you know leaders are all wanting to do their best too. Like as educators, I have these things I want to achieve, and then my leaders, like they want these things too, and they're helping me pave that way forward. They're helping me remove those barriers. So
Mhm.
I think from the system we need to look at what those barriers are, and we need to start kind of picking away at them slowly but surely. And that's something I have seen a dramatic shift when compared to when I started as a nurse to what it is now. I've noticed that people are starting to listen. And
Mm.
I've started to see really massive shift. There's more education out there. There's more listening to what nurses have to say. There's more celebrating the small things that start to happen on the day to day. And I cannot be so happy to hear and see this happen.
Yeah, I what you're describing, the thing that comes to mind for me is this new kind of leadership that's coming to the forefront, going from the old command and control hierarchical leadership to something that's much more collaborative and distributed leadership or shared leadership. And for me, it happens on a relational foundation, a platform. And I love what you're saying about the open door policies, because I frankly, I'll just bluntly say, like, open door policies don't work. And the reason why they don't work is because they create a bit of a cocoon for leaders to be drawn into this vortex of operational demand and tasks and emails and all that's there. And they, the open door doesn't get knocked on very often. It will if you do the work at the beginning to embody that relational equity and go out into the floor, like you're talking about, shoulder to shoulder, developing relationships. Eventually you'll succession will happen and you will be able to do what you need to do. The problem, and so I'll play the devil's advocate a little bit with this, because from a leadership perspective, the operational demand on leaders is incredibly big as well. It feels like a huge burden for leaders. I know that that's true. And oftentimes leaders kind of get lost in the shuffle here a little bit in terms of their own self-care. and learning how to self-regulate themselves and really to harness what's going on inside of them and to lead authentically and genuinely and vulnerably. Systemically, I would love to see support and education that teaches leaders how to be vulnerable, how to be honest, how to be real with what's going on, because leadership is not about getting more things done. It's about creating an environment where your team is thriving and you're encouraging and supporting them to do the work that they're here to do. So you're almost disappearing as a leader, in my opinion. That said, though, what can we do to help leaders that are in that transition from command and control and hierarchy to a more relational, distributed model, especially when we have really toxic things going on like bullying and harassment and gossip and all the things that managers and leaders are dealing with all day long, collective bargaining agreements, a unionized environment, all that stuff. It feels so daunting to think about that. And I'm curious what kinds of small suggestions that you have for those leaders that are trying to make that, to extricate themselves from the operational demand so they can actually develop relationships with people.
And I love this question so much because I'm not completely naive to what's happening out there. And I know operations are going to be priorities every single day. You're going to have to show up. You're going to have deliverables. You're going to have to meet these deadlines. And so it's not freaking easy. But we also have to recognize if we keep leaning onto that mentality and that rhetoric, we're going to start to burn out because
Right.
those priorities will never stop becoming priorities. And I have been there. I have seen it. I have tried to meet deadlines. And I think we really need to be okay to show up to say, hey, this is what's on my plate right now. And I feel like I'm burning out. I feel like the weight of the world is on me and feeling okay to say things like that. But we also have to topple it to be like, well, what is the ramifications now if I say
Mm-hmm.
something like that? And so you mentioned it beautifully in the very beginning part of our session that we're trying to co-design something. We're trying to come to the table together to design and create meaningful change. And I think it kind of starts with that. One example I'll bring in, and this happened, there was a lot of tension after the heat wave when that happened. And a lot of British Columbians suffered from that heat wave, and a lot of frontline healthcare workers suffered
Mm-hmm.
because of their moral distress of wanting to help and not getting enough resources to help. And something that our leader did in the hospital that I found so profound was she opened up a space and there was no structure to it. It was just a space. And she wanted to hear from all of us how we felt going into this and what were some solution. Like she set up two. One was just feelings and then one was for solution. And I thought that was just so beautifully done because to show up in a space like that could not have been easy. And in talking to the nurses, they had some things they wanted to get off their chest. And so I think coming into that space, recognizing what is going to be said and being okay with that and just admitting I didn't know what to do in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried my best. This is what my decision making was like. And I want to do better by you. I want to do
Mm-hmm.
better by the whole team because we all want to do this job and we all wanted to be here. I could see your collective energy here. And then so that second session was just kind of looking at solutions. Like, tell me any small thing. I want to see if we can make it. And from then on out, it made the leader so real.
Mm-hmm.
And and it almost felt like, and I don't know if this was happening, but it almost felt like things were taking off her plate because this became such a big priority. And was because she showed up authentically and she now
Right.
has all these things that the staff are saying they wanted to get changed. And magically, operations recognize that and we're like, well, we don't need you to do finance. We don't need you. We've got people for this. Like, you know what? Focus on your staff. And those never stop becoming priorities, but we managed to just find a way to deal with those priorities. It was just
Just
interesting.
Yeah, this is so cool, this example that you're bringing, because it's the one that I see over and over again as a theme and pattern. And that is when a leader's willing to really put themselves on the line and challenge their own fears and concerns, and generate that space. It's a relational space where the equity of the whole group it's like a rising tide lifts all boats in that space. And all those operational demands that were so easy to be distracted by start to change in ways that you could never forecast, because you've got a group of people all coming together and working on it in a different way, but it always starts in the same way. And that's with a leader who's willing to show up like that. So it makes me wonder, what are one or two or maybe even three small ingredients that leader has to have inside to do that?
Well, coming into any space, I think really important is that curiosity mindset,
Right.
being vulnerable. And I think the biggest one, and I have learned throughout my time as an educator, as a nurse, is really being compassionate, and being compassionate for yourself,
Right.
and being kind to yourself, and being kind to the person in front of you. And how that compassion shows up is through empathy. And
Mm,
so I think it's the more you lean into that, and back when my parents were raising me growing up, they're like, you got to know these technical hard skills, like that's gonna what makes you successful. And over time, they're like, well, actually, maybe these soft skills, and they're even going away from soft skills because they're just so tangible.
right.
These are the things that are creating meaningful relationships and change.
Mm. Yeah, I really appreciate the last ingredient you shared there, being like self-acceptance, self-compassion, even self-love. Can we even say that? So I wonder, so just to kind of bring this home, what's one area where you're practicing more self-acceptance in your own work right now, Ellison?
I just try to show up and realize I'm doing the best that I can. And I'm passionate about the work that I do. And I'm showing up, and I'm doing this mentorship. I'm trying my best,
Yeah,
and being okay with just doing and trying your best, and
yeah.
accepting that that's enough, and that is okay.
That's all you can do. I really appreciate this conversation. So the area where I'm being more self-compassionate as a result of this conversation is with my grad research that I'm going to be doing in the fall. It's like I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to hope for the best, and do the best I can. So that's the area I'm going to practice this week. So Ellison, just bringing things to a close now, how can people get in touch with you and share with you going forward? What's the best way to reach out?
Absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active. Feel free to reach me out. I think my profile is public there. You can either follow or connect with me if you have any questions. I'm happy to talk education. I'm happy to talk healthcare or leadership. Yeah, just feel free to reach out.
Now, I'll put that in the show notes for everybody. So definitely reach out to Ellison and connect with him. Ellison, thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful to talk to you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Now, thank you so much for being here and listening to the end. By all means, please reach out to Ellison on LinkedIn. In the show notes, his LinkedIn link is there so that you can message him and just let him know what today's episode meant to you and what you learned today. I know that he's going to love that if you do that. The other thing that I would encourage you to do as well is if you could just take a moment and leave a review and a rating for this podcast on whatever platform you're listening on, that would be really helpful for getting new guests, different guests, and bringing in different people from around the world to support you in developing your safe space clinically in your leadership team. Thanks again so much for listening, and remember to be a safe space. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.